history, memories. Every time you run a marathon or you watch someone run a marathon, in one way or another, you're commemorating the Battle of Marathon from 490 BC, which was the conclusion of the first Persian-Greek war of classical antiquity, and the beginning of this long 25 centuries, often on relationship, military struggle, war with Persia, between Persia and the West, of course, Persia now being called Iran. So this raises interesting questions in respect of it, and I think to stand back from the conflict a bit and simply ask, much like has been made famous by the Art of War, trying to look at how the Chinese, in their feudal period, waged wars, local wars, between smaller states. And what this tells us about military strategy, the most quoted remark being the greatest, finest way, the best way of winning a war is not having to fight one enemy at all. And there's a wisdom, of course, in that. But here I'd like to reflect on a different tradition, the Persian tradition, and ask what is the Persian art of war, the Iranian art of war, and what is its manifestation today? And as the propaganda battle tends to be so intense about these things, it's difficult to discuss them coolly, with some sense of history, some sense of standing back and saying, what exactly is going on here? Now, what's remarkable, if the pieces we are assembling of how the Iranians have prepared for this conflict and how many decades they have prepared, and if the thoroughness of their preparation is being accurately understood. The first thing you might say, and it's an Asian virtue, an extraordinary Asian virtue, especially compared, Europeans are better, but Americans, people in a hurry, this patience thing. I mean, the observation made at the time in Vietnam by one sage Vietnamese to an American of some authority was, if you're that keen to be in Vietnam, wait, and you may be reborn a Vietnamese. Again, the notion of time. The Iranians have been fantastically patient. They have had few cards to play. On the face of it, the few cards they have been expanded, improved, played extremely well in very difficult circumstance against powerful enemies. Israel, the dominant local power in the Middle East, the United States, the world's hegemon. Iran is facing off both of them at the moment, and it hasn't been the kind of collapse that was predicted. So one of them is patience, the longer view. Circumstances have pressed Iran to organize itself in this way because it has so few options. It cannot fight a conventional war against the United States and expect to win any more than Vietnam did. I mean, Vietnam circumstances were altered beyond recognition because of the consequences of the Chinese Civil War, which brought communist power to the very border of Vietnam, which meant that an American ground invasion to conquer North Vietnam was almost inconceivable. It would be Korea all over again. You would have to deal with potentially millions of Chinese troops, a figure we'll come back to. And at the same time, given the power, I mean, the Soviet Union for one, and China later became a nuclear power, the idea of using nuclear weapons against Hanoi or Haiphong or what have you was unthinkable because of the possible repercussions. I mean, it's all very charming to say, we'll just take out the North Vietnamese and they'll do as we say, and quite another to lose Seattle in the process. So this is this business of thinking about it. Enemies. So one of them is the patience. The other one is, and this has become a theme that, of course, Ukraine has created, asymmetrical warfare. If you cannot win a conventional warfare, then how do you proceed? And the digressions here, there would have to be someday, historians will have to go back and look at all of this because the claims and counterclaims are so contradictory. But the description, the media workaday Western media description of what's happening in terms of missile attacks on Israel, and the reality seems to be completely out of course in that the conventional reporting is Iran fired X number of missiles and a few got through. Now, the Iranian analysis is we fire all those missiles to exhaust your interceptors and then they get through. Entirely different way of reading it. Now, the fact that there's more one reading a situation like this is not surprising. The fact that the Western media is so silent on this issue, it just assumes one thing and repeats it over and over again, doesn't give the American public or the public in Western Europe, for that matter, or the Israeli public, if they have access to these things, any kind of purchase on what is going on from the Iranian point of view. And warfare is two-sided. You have to understand the other side. So one of them is this tactical, given the asymmetrical power relationship, how would you fight the war? And what would victory mean? This comes back again to this third point about Vietnam again. As it was said at the time, and it has been said since, it wasn't necessary for the Vietnamese to win in any conventional sense. It wasn't possible. It was for them to last, not be defeated, if you will. The people who had to win were the Americans, and if the Americans didn't win, they would go home, and they did go home. They did not win. So this business of how the game, the fundamental rule of the game about who lives in the Middle East and who doesn't, and even Israel is a long way from Iran. The United States is, vast distance from Iran. Iran lives there on the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. It's not called that for nothing. And that has implications that, again, the reporting refuses to take into account. The fact that the Emirate leaders want the United States to stand firm to protect them from Iran and supposedly reduce Iran's offensive power to nil so that the Gulf states are safe. Is that plausible? Hasn't the strategic position altered to the point where, if the Emirates and what have you, even Saudi Arabia, are going to continue to march in good order, they're going to have to come to grips with the fact that the power relationship in the place they live has altered. The fantastic resilience of the Iranians and the fantastic determination, these buried sites, these manufacturing of thousands of weapons, despite Israel's extraordinary security apparatus, apparently either wasn't known or not acknowledged. So you've got this business going on, this endless supply of, they're running out tomorrow, they'll run out next Tuesday, and they haven't run out by next Tuesday. Again, as I mentioned in an earlier podcast, ambushed a credibility gap. There is a credibility gap in the Western reporting about the war, and there's a credibility gap in what the relevant governments are saying about the war. It's not even plausible. Not even plausible. Now, fifthly, given the asymmetrical nature, and given Iran's position, and given the energy politics and the petrodollar consequence, what have you, there is a pinch point here. The Iranians may suffer, but the damage they can do to the world economy because of where they are, vis-a-vis all those resources, natural gas, petroleum refinement, all of that, let alone tourism, aircraft patterns, the fact that so many of the key cables for the world computing system runs through the opportunities for mischief on the part of the Tehran government are almost infinite. They have cards. And to pretend in your policy statements that they don't have cards is not plausible. I don't think. So again, we have this notion. There is a book to be written about the Iranian Art of War, and we're going to learn to write it in our own blood if we're not careful. And that is where we'll leave it now. But the historians have a task to undertaken, and the task they're undertaking to their honor is not being addressed even in its most basic preliminary form by the relevant government spokesman and the international media. And therefore, it's places like all of a sudden social media bursts into its almost full potential of at least giving us an idea of what is